symbolic necessity rather than logical necessity, I have to tell you, I really don't know what that means. Um, can barely grasp the concept of logical necessity after years of study. But now that Landsberg has revealed himself as a Christian, he really has, in thinking by this section 5, the ontological basis, we get kind of a picture of if we ask ourselves, what necessity means in this context. Necessity is must. Necessity is have to. In a logical sense, it's very dry. This conclusion has to follow, must follow from these premises. It's logically necessary. The only way that I can think of it that makes any sense, I guess, is symbolic necessity of death for the person is to retain that sense of have to or must, but make it much more personal and something that must be undergone, something that must be faced, and that's an existential thought, that death must be faced. But with Landsberg, it's bigger, I think, more ambitious. It must be transformed. It must be gone through, but it must also be spiritually transformed by the person. The threat of death. Death must be overcome. The final, I think, viewpoint here is very Christian. Death is the enemy. Death is bad, and the significance of Christ is that he banishes death. He doesn't say death is a good thing, you can now accept it because I'm here. He says, I banish death. Death is gone on all levels. So as a Christian, death becomes not just a looming reality, an imminent possibility, but a challenge and a task. That is, that the human person must overcome death, It's called upon, challenged to transform death, to transform defeat into victory. And at a certain point, there's no doubt we leave philosophy in this essay and we move into either mysticism or theology, depending on how he's putting things. But we leave the realm of not what can be rationally talked about, but what can be given any kind of evidence for either an experience or reasonable discourse. But that's not to say it's a weakness of the text. It's not a weakness at all. The text is what it is. So we left off with this notion that his metaphysics is the metaphysics of being, and his metaphysics of the person is really a metaphysics of the person as being the self, as something which is going towards fulfillment. And that fulfillment is something that transcends death. That is, that fulfillment is not something that happens before death, and we are fulfilled as human beings, and then we die. No, that's not what he's talking about. We are fulfilled as persons through death, through our transcending or overcoming our transformation of death. And no doubt this leads into ideas about life after death, put it that way, ideas of immortality, but they're not entirely mystical. They're grounded in his metaphysics of the person, and I think that the key here is his distinction between hope and expectation. And it's hope that's important. He says at the end of the first paragraph on 206, metaphysics do not originate in the nothingness revealed by anguish, but in the being which by its very nature participates in the philosophic eros. Thus, the ontological character of the person is not derived from a negative which the person can only accept. That seems to be his criticism of existentialism, especially Heidegger, that being towards death just being an acceptance of what Yassers would call the shipwreck, the limit experience of death, acceptance of its inevitability, its finality, and our helplessness towards it. Landsberg rejects that. The special decision through which the person may, in fact, become existence towards death is an intermediate state between this primary exteriority of death and the hope of the spirit which transcends death itself. The hope of the spirit which transcends death itself. That is this hope, which is different from expectation. but this hope, which is the hope of the continuation of the self, not just the continuation of the self, but the hope that the self can become what it truly is, which is what it's truly meant to be, being what it truly is. Continues on page 206, the finality of death is only felt as suffering when the act which would have pointed towards survival and eternity has been swallowed up in despair. That despair being the opposite of hope, hopelessness, despair. And then he says something quite interesting. The anguish of death, and not only the pain of dying, would be incomprehensible if the fundamental structure of our being did not include the existential postulate of something beyond. That's extremely interesting. The anguish of death, not only the pain of dying, that is, the pain of dying would be painful whether there was a God, whether there was no God, whether we were spirit, it would still hurt. It would be pain and suffering, dying. But the anguish of death, the anguish, the sense of hopelessness of death is only explicable on the basis of hope, the existential postulate of something beyond. If we were just simply natural creatures, bodies, members of a species, human animals, death would include no anguish. It would be painful. But again, the whole idea of the menace of death, threat of death, is it annihilates something that's not just my body, but my spirit, or my self as a person. The anguish of death is the anguish that is threatened. And so what he's saying there is that anguish is only possible because of the existential postulate of something beyond. That is, it's something that is built into the structure of our being, which points beyond this human animal, points beyond to something more. So he says a little bit farther down, at the root of all being there is an act, the affirmation of the self. The affirmation of the self. And it's this affirmation of the self. And that affirmation of the self is a denial of death. It's the denial that death or non-being or annihilation could ever happen to the self. That the self is not the sort of thing that can be annihilated. And that the self, and as a person, well, one more talk, I'm sorry, we're going to need. But as a person, not simply as a disembodied sort of, well, yes, a disembodied, but not just sort of as an abstract spirit or a generic spirit, generic self, but as the personal self, as the person, the unique person that one is, that continues. And that is hope. The opposite would be despair, hopelessness. He says at the bottom of 206, faith in a personal survival. A personal survival. This is very Christian, as we'll see, very non-Platonic. Of a personal survival is not merely a comforting thought. It is above all the expression, the actual shape given to this ontological factor. Death considered as finality, physical death considered as the universal negation of our existence, is only the reflection of a despairing unbelief, a negation of the person by the person. That experience that he described earlier, that root, incredibly crucial experience of the death of the other, death of a friend, is quite important, because at that moment it might just be despair. That is, if one thinks that the death of the body means the annihilation of the person, that would be despair. What Landsberg seems to be thinking is that would be a denial of self. That is, the denial of the self that I am right now, the self that I know, as far as I know it. That is, to give in to that despair, to believe that in the case of the other, the loved one, that their disappearance means their annihilation, would be to give in to a despairing unbelief, a negation of the person by the person. That is, only we can do that, right? Only we can negate ourselves as persons by refusing to believe in the continuation of the person beyond death. So this notion of hope, as opposed to expectation, is built into the structure of our being. One might say it's an ontological character of the person. What is hope? Page 207, hope, this act of personal existence, is essentially different from the multiple emotions we can describe as hope in the sense of the expectation of something. This does not mean that it lacks volitional content. Hope does, in fact, possess content. but what it does not possess is a variable content. We can expect anything. And expectation is about desire. It's about wants, needs, and expecting, looking forward to hopefully getting them. And it can be about anything. Right? Variable desires, variable content. Hope is only got one content. It is a structure of being, transcending the psychic structure. Its content is immanent and truly its own. This content exists only in hope, and hope exists only in moving towards this content. That is, hope is only about one thing. Hope is really about us, I think, is what he's saying. Hope is about our being itself, and the nature of that being as something that transcends death, that survives death. Hope and expectation both appear to move towards the future, but there are two futures involved, appertaining to two kinds of time. The future of expectation is in the future of the world, in which one hopes for the fulfillment of certain desires. The future of hope is the future of my own person, in which I shall fulfill myself. Very Catholic, very Christian, very Catholic, very Thomistic, I would say. Very Thomas Aquinas. I think I read that recently for another class I'm teaching. A notion that God is the end, in a sense of the purpose or goal of every human being, the primary end, and everything is for that. That seems to be the content of hope here, is the fulfilling of the self in God, and the fulfilling of the self where the self becomes really what it was meant to be. Of course, death is the necessary thing, and that's what makes it paradoxical. Death is the enemy. We are legitimated in our hatred of death here. It's not something we need to accept. Wow, that's a relief in a way. I'm not being called upon to either say my death is nothing or that my death is something I simply have to accept. My death, Landsberg seemed to say, built into Christianity is a rejection of death, a banishing of death, and an affirmation of eternal life, true life, which is eternal life, God. Expectation has its roots in impatience. I really want a hamburger. Oh, I really wish it was Friday. Expectation. Always anticipating its future and always doubting of itself. Hope tends in principle towards truth. Expectation in principle towards illusion. The illusion that it really matters whether it's Friday, whether that be so great. Hope is not like that. Right? Expectation is illusion. Hope is towards truth, the truth. What does that mean? Well, he says on page 208, hope tends towards being. That is, the true is what is. This is real traditional metaphysics, man. The truth and being are different ways of describing the same thing. Truth is not just something that attaches in this technical way about statements about the world. Truth is being, and to be truthful is to be in the fullest sense. So it's built in. Hope creates by giving structure to being. So hope is both necessary to be, and it's an outgrowth of being. That is, we are hopeful because we are, and our hope is what gives structure to our being, helps us to be. So really quite something, I'd say, and maybe there's one more talk that's necessary here, not about the next section on Augustine, but number 7, section 7, the forms of the experience of death, in which he makes some necessary distinctions between what he's getting at as a Christian and some other philosophical attitudes towards immortality and generally classical philosophical attitudes towards death. So one more talk and then we'll wrap it up.